Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Pedestrian and Bicycling Planning Tools webinar, one of the many interactive technical assistance events being offered through the PlanIt education and training program to planners, consultants, elected officials, and technical staff as local governments prepare to begin comprehensive plan updates. My name is Salma Safila, an associate planner in local planning assistance at the Metropolitan Council, and I will be your moderator today. Before we start, let's go over some housekeeping that will be pasted into the chat. Today's webinar is being recorded. Feel free to turn on live captions within Teams. We will be sharing a link to the webinar with you after the event. We welcome you to revisit the contents yourself and share it with colleagues. Feel free to raise your hand or enter a question in the chat throughout today's presentation, and our speaker will be happy to answer. We will also have dedicated time at the end of the presentation for some more questions and discussion. Today's event will be led by transportation professionals Joseph Whiting, Jacob Wiscalis, Ryan Dussel, and Caroline Ketchum. Joe Whiting is a senior transportation planner in MTS who has worked on developing the active transportation program and solicitation and is now leading the program. He has previously worked for municipalities in the region working on street design and comprehensive planning, and for MnDOT on system and investment planning. Jacob Wiscalis coordinates MnDOT's pedestrian and bicyclist data program. Through a network of permanent and portable counters, this program supports active transportation investment by collecting a range of pedestrian and bicyclist data to help planners, engineers, and designers better understand user behavior in a variety of settings. Prior to joining MnDOT, Jacob worked as a research scientist at Wilder Research, a writer and data analyst at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and a GIS analyst at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs. A native of Virginia, Jacob has lived in Minnesota for the past 2 decades. Ryan Dussel is a multimodal planner in MnDOT's Office of Transit and Active Transportation in St. Paul. Ryan supports MnDOT's statewide pedestrian and bicycle data program, active transportation community of practice, U.S. bicycle route planning efforts, and provides general assistance across various programs. Ryan has previously worked in transportation planning and traffic safety research. And last but not least, Caroline Ketchum. Caroline is an active transportation planner at MnDOT, leading the development of the State Bike Plan update, including the development of the Impact Bicycling Planning Tool, and led the update of the Pause Pedestrian Planning Tool. And with that, I will now turn it over to our experts. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sama. So we will move right into the presentation here. So we'll have about 10 minutes or so at the end of this to answer any questions, but as Sama said, anytime if you feel like raising your hand, if a question, feel free to jump in. We can talk through this as we move through the presentation. So today, first, we'll kind of give an overview of those comprehensive plan requirements, specifically ones that tie directly to our topic today on pedestrian and bicycle data and planning tools that we'll be presenting. First, we'll go over regional data that is available for our local communities to utilize in their local comprehensive planning and kind of where that is and what that looks like. Then we'll move over to some MnDOT tools that MnDOT's been developing to help with planning for both pedestrian and bicycle use and system planning. And then we'll have a section here at the end to talk a bit about our pedestrian bicycle counter tools, which is available at MnDOT, and some others that are available at the private sector. And then we'll kind of outline some upcoming events that are related to today's webinar. And then we'll have, again, some time at the end for questions if there is any then. So first here, we'll start as we do all these plan webinars to kind of, again, talk about those requirements and those advisory guidance items for your comprehensive planning efforts for 2050, especially ones that relate directly to our pedestrian and bicycle data and planning tools. So on the bicycle side, so the minimum requirements are going to be described in mapping the full local existing and planned bike network, which includes including and identifying a local bikeway connection to transit facilities if they are present. We're asking communities to describe and map the RBTN, the Regional Bicycle Transportation Network, within your community. And then finally, a new one here, we'll be asking communities to describe and map regional bicycle barriers and discuss how to address the need to provide new or improved crossings of those regional bicycle barriers. On the pedestrian side, so pedestrian requirements are new this cycle, and so this is something we will be talking about today as well. So we are looking, requiring communities to include a full pedestrian element of their local transportation element of the comprehensive plans, which including mapping the existing pedestrian network and identifying and mapping any locally developed pedestrian priority networks or areas if those are applicable. And some of these tools will help us kind of identify those in our local communities as well. On the other side here, so those are our minimum requirements. Those are what required to include in your comprehensive plans. These next two pages will be looking at items which we're not going to be required of including. We are encouraging communities to do so to develop more robust elements for the pedestrian and bicycle plans in their comprehensive plans. Looking at the bicycle advisory guidance, so first looking to use those regional bicycle data and planning tools as developed by MnDOT. We highlight here MnDOT Space Tool, which we have a link to, which we'll look and explore here, but we also be able to premiere our MnDOT's newest planning tool, which they're calling the Impact Tool. We can't give out the link to that quite yet, but we'll be looking, give a little preview what that looks like and kind of talk a bit about how that can help you prioritize networks in your local systems. We are requesting requesting communities also include, thinking about collecting bicycle count data in their community to understand where the usage is happening around their community and to assess any local barriers. So we're requiring communities to include those regional barriers, and those will be provided to you, but we also requesting that communities also consider those local barriers to travel as well as those regional barriers. On the pedestrian side, looking for communities to plan and integrate any safe route school planning going on already in your community. Also looking for communities to collect pedestrian data similar to bicycle collecting as well. Looking to, again, similar to bicycle, look to assess those pedestrian travel barriers, and then also encouraging communities to utilize those demand assessment tools, the pause tool specifically here, which MnDOT will be which we talk about in a little bit. So that we'll kind of move on next. Our first section here is talking about regional data, which is available that you can download and utilize in your own local planning to help you develop these local elements of your transportation plans in your communities. First, here was probably one that most folks are familiar with, which is our regional bicycle transportation network. So this was originally developed in 2014 and incorporated in 2040 plans. This has continued to grow and be developed through the years here, and this is something we, again, are requiring communities to include in their local plans. So here I will share just a preview of what we do have both an interactive web map, so you can kind of look at your community and understand where those alignments and corridors are located within your communities. And additionally, we have this data available to download and incorporate in your local plans. But as you can see here, this map shows our tier 1 alignments, our tier 1 corridors, our tier 2 alignments, our tier 2 corridors. Additionally, part of this set here is what we call regional destinations. So think of your major activity destinations, stadiums, major regional parks, things of that nature, so you can understand kind of where those activity generators are at the regional level and be able to incorporate that into your local planning. Additionally, we also have our regional transitway destinations on here too, as you think about incorporating those transitway destinations with your active transportation planning at the local level. The RBTN is a regionally identified bike network. It's really meant for planning and investment prioritization only. So the RBTN alignments do not guarantee there's a facility located there today. So these are really identified for future facilities if there is none there today, or to identify those facilities that exist today, which provide the most transportation benefit for regional bicycle travel in the region. As I mentioned, that data is available to download as well. We have links that we'll be providing at the webinar landing page as well, which include all these links that we got in this presentation that you can find in one location. Moving on here, I do want to mention our regional trail data set as well. I did see Colin Kelly from our product store in here, but I just want to announce here that we also have the regional trail data. So the RBTN is specific to regional transportation, and that's one aspect of regional bicycle travel. We also have our regional trail network, which we identify working with our local partners to identify, and also is data available download. Regional trails are really defined by our local partners within these search corridors and along the alignments, and are approved and adopted by the council once those planning efforts are completed. Regional trail long range plans must be approved before the trail alignments are finalized. So you can see here a lot of these search corridors are still out there, and those are just ones that do not have a regional trail plan finalized to identify the alignments within those corridors. Look to incorporate both these alignments and these search corridors within your planning efforts as well to help us identify the regional trail network throughout the region. And as I mentioned, this is also available to download as well. I won't show you that, but that link will be made available. And I will point you to this. Our parks friends have also already done a PlanIt webinar on their specific regional parks and trails system and kind of the considerations you should be thinking about as you develop your local comprehensive plans. I mean, that can be available to view or review those materials that were provided for that webinar. Moving on to additional regional data available. So as I mentioned, the regional bicycle barriers will be something required to be incorporated into local comprehensive plans. This is going to be new for 2050. So this data set was not quite developed for the last previous round. And so this is something that will be new for communities to include in their planning. The regional bicycle barriers identifies regional level barriers to bicycle travel, things like freeways, major rivers, railroads, streams, things like that present a very large scale barrier to development that would require a regional kind of resource to meet those barriers. It does not include local travel barriers. Think of like your major arterials or roadways smaller than your interstates or freeways in the region. And I will give a preview of that, how that looks here. So as I mentioned, similar to our regional bicycle transportation network, we both have an interactive web map, which you can kind of peruse and look around at your own leisure. And then we also have this data available for download to incorporate in your local plans. But as I mentioned, this web map identifies different types of barriers. So you got your expressways, your streams, your rail, and your rivers. That will identify those regional barriers to travel. This will also include the RBTN alignments if you want to compare where RBTN alignments are comparatively to those regional barriers. Additionally, the regional bicycle barrier network also includes crossing areas. These locations here are areas which are crossing locations identified from the study. It's not the only crossing locations, right? You can obviously cross a barrier wherever it makes sense to your local network, but these are kind of regional nodes that in the study were identified as the most logical crossing locations for these barriers. And that's the wrong one. And as I mentioned again, this is also available for download, and so we'd be encouraged to download this data and include that in your local comprehensive plan. Moving on to pedestrian. So those are our regional bike data sets that are specific to those planning tools that we've developed over the past decade. But we also have been developing planning specific for our safety of pedestrians in the region. So in 2022, the Met Council developed the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, can be located at the link here, and also we will be providing that link following here. This plan identifies risk factors and countermeasures for pedestrian safety in the region, and we have a graphic here to kind of show what it looks like for Hennepin County, but identifies both those injuries and fatalities over the previous planning period, as well as potential risk factors for both pedestrians and cyclists. These static maps are included in the plan, and then the data is available in our data atlas. So this data atlas is specific for a regional solicitation, but it does include a lot of important data that is relevant for our local planning as well. And I can show you what that looks like here. So you open up the data atlas, and you navigate to the safety tab specifically, and you have multiple tabs here. So the most important information for our pedestrian planning would be our regional top 25 priority segments in the region, identifying kind of those highest crash factors for pedestrians. And we also have one for bicycles here as well. In addition to that, we do have what we call the bicycle crash risk index. So this kind of indexes the risk around the region on our A minor and higher arterials. You can see here and identifies those arterials from lower risk to higher risk. So thinking about proactive safety for bicycles, this is a good tool to identify kind of those areas where risk factors are there if maybe the data isn't quite there yet. Additionally, we do have several high injury streets, which identify high injury network for all users. So it doesn't just include pedestrian bikes, but also includes vehicles and things like that. But this is also another tool as you're thinking about those planning efforts in your local areas, kind of where are those corridors that are maybe at the highest existing issues with safety in the region here. As I mentioned, this isn't the data atlas, but this data is all available to download as well, and those links will be included in that document I mentioned previously. So now we'll move on to additional data we do have available that will hopefully help our communities develop those local existing systems for both pedestrian and bicycle networks. So the Met Council has what we call the Metro Collaborative Trails and Bikeway data set. The link is included here and will be included in our web sheet as well. This is a partial data set of bike facilities in the region. This data set was created with help of the counties in late 2019, early 2020. It has not been updated since then, so there's going to be quite a lot of out-of-date information, right? If anything had been constructed since 2020, it hadn't necessarily been added to this, but this is a good start for some of those networks and our local areas. It is missing some key counties, so Anoka County is missing from this, and some other information is not quite as robust as we'd like. Hopefully, we'll be working on updating this in the future, but this is something that is something here. Again, as I mentioned, it's a good base to start mapping those local networks, but it is not exhaustive. So again, remember that. So you can use this, consider this as a base for your local networks, but obviously if you built something after 2020, it won't be represented here. And potentially, if you're in Anoka County, you might not have the data at all. When mapping your local networks, consider following the attribute data here as feasible. So this attribute data is really being systemized for the region. So, as we're developing this regional data set, it's nice to have consistent data, then easier to clean in and kind of apply that consistently throughout the region. Not required, but if you are building a GIS data set of your local network, we do hope that you at least try to follow some of these data metrics and considerations like that as you're developing those data sets. Now, on the state side, Jacob, I don't know if you want to hop in here and talk a bit about this, but MnDOT also produces their own statewide data set that also includes the metro region and potentially has maybe more robust data than we have available at the regional level.
Yeah, I will jump in. Yeah, so MnDOT also maintains a bikeways map, but it's statewide in this case. And it can be, it can serve as a resource that may be helpful to you when you're trying to better understand bikeways in your community and also in neighboring communities if you want to make connections. I'm going to drop a link to it in the chat if this works. Oh, that didn't work.
I do have the web page up too, if you wanted to explore that a little bit.
Sure, yeah. It includes information about facility type. So if you zoom in and click on a segment, a little pop-up window will show up. Yep. It has facility type like off-road, on-road, one-way, two-way, shared use, but also surface type, like if it's a natural surface, concrete, asphalt. And like the tool that Joe mentioned earlier, this is not 100% comprehensive. MnDOT actually sends out a letter every other year to county engineers requesting shape files of active transportation infrastructure. We request it. It's not compulsory. It's just all data that's requested, and so sometimes we get it and sometimes we don't. In addition to engineers, we also get some of these shape files from planners and GIS professionals when they learn about the Minnesota Bikeways map. So I think it's pretty good, but it could be useful when you're sort of weighing bikeway connectivity in your city, within your city, and with neighboring communities. And we also have a bikeways data standard. It establishes a single commonly accepted set of attribute specifications like field name, type, length. Yeah, back to you, Joe.
Yeah, and thanks, Jake. But I think this is probably a simpler standard to meet too, right? Just some key attributes of these facilities. The width, the length, the surface type, who owns the facility. These are pretty standard information sets that goes a long way to help understanding the system.
The development of that standard predated my tenure at MnDOT, but I was told that it was developed by the GAC. And I don't know what that means, but it's the GAC. And I think the G stands for geospatial and committee at the end. Geospatial Advisory Committee, probably. But anyway, back to you.
All right, appreciate that. And as Jacob mentioned, I mentioned, these are not exhaustive sources, but combine these two sources together, you can get a good idea of a base of what your local system looks like for mapping, and then hopefully and build that out from there. If there's new facilities or facilities we are not representing on these regional or statewide data sets yet.
Also, and we'll take any submissions. If you find, if you're exploring these maps and you find that your facilities are not included, please contact me because we want to get it included into our statewide map.
Yes, that too. I think it's the more information we can always have is the better. So I appreciate that plug as well. Now, looking at the pedestrian side, so I would say in comparison to the bike side is very robust compared to what we have for pedestrian data. I will say here, we do not have a regional data set for pedestrian networks yet. I'm keeping that yet as we are developing a process and project to get that information. We are working on a two-phase solution to developing a project to actually understand all the pedestrian facilities in the region. This will not be likely finished in time. We're estimating we will get the mapping completed by Q4 2027. So likely you'll be deep in your comp planning by the end of next year. And so this potentially might not work, but it is something that if we do have this available, we will certainly let communities know that this data set is available, and it'll be able to download and utilize in your local comprehensive plans if possible. But I just do want to note that it may not be possible, but we are developing a regional data set which will be able to be utilized for future instances in obviously next planning cycle or any local planning efforts beyond the 2050 comprehensive plans. However, there are different open source networks that we do. I just want to highlight as potentially useful in your local mapping efforts. So potentially one way to consider this is, right, a lot of sidewalks are traditionally built along roadway corridors, whether by ordinance or by developers. So potentially you could consider your roadway network as a base for sidewalks if you don't have any sidewalk data available, right? So this is something that you could consider. Looking at your roadway network, you can then identify what roads have sidewalks and what do not, and that way, if that works for you. But as I mentioned, we do have third-party sources. A good one here is called OpenStreetMap. You haven't heard about that, but I will show you what that looks like. We got to move this out of the way. Thank you. So OpenStreetMap is a open source data set that the general public can build upon and identify local infrastructure, whether that's biking or pedestrian in their community, and then add it to this map here. It's a pretty robust map. Again, these are generally identified by local residents and then confirmed through an open source process. It does include things like sidewalks, things like trails, bikeways, and things like that in your local community. And this is also available data you can export and download in a GIS format. So you can identify your local community, you can export and download the data, and then you could utilize that to help potentially build out your pedestrian network in a GIS level. So this is a pretty cool tool. It's obviously got a lot of different types of facilities here, from your roadways all the way down to footpaths to cycleways to pedestrian sidewalks, things like that. So it's a pretty robust source again, but this is something that is identified by local residents and then generally confirmed through an open source format. So it might not always be entirely accurate, but it is a really good source to consider when you're considering identifying your local pedestrian networks, as we do not quite have a regional data set of that yet. I do want to make it clear too here, while we are requiring identifying the existing pedestrian system in your local community, these do not need to be in GIS format. We want to make this easy for all of our community types to be able to meet the standard. And so, it could be a static map that you develop internally. It could be you print out a Google Maps and you draw it with a pen, right, and scan that. We're not going to be too restrictive on how you develop and show us your pedestrian system, but we do want you as a community to show where that is in your local networks, and also identify those yourself and understand kind of where your pedestrian networks are and maybe where those pedestrian gaps exist for them to be hopefully filled in the future as you develop your pedestrian systems following this planning effort here. So again, I want to make clear that we are requiring that these networks be identified, but we are not necessarily requiring a certain type of way to identify them. So if a GIS option seems a little too intensive for your community, we are not going to be requiring you to submit GIS data sets or anything like that. We just want you to be able to identify that network in your local plan and begin to think about filling those potentially pedestrian network gaps in your local communities. All right, so that was the data sources we have available. So next we'll be switching gears to talk not necessarily on hard data, but thinking about those planning tools. And MnDOT has been developing a lot of really great, robust planning tools that help local planning over the last couple of years here. And we're going to be showing some existing tools, and we'll be previewing a new tool that MnDOT is developing and hopefully we'll be releasing later this year. So with that said, I can turn it over to our MnDOT friends.
Hey everybody, nice to see you all, and thanks so much for having us here to talk about some of our tools. My name is Caroline Ketchum. I'm an active transportation planner with MnDOT, and going to give you a brief overview of some of our bike and pedestrian prioritization tools that we've developed internally. The first one that we're going to talk about is our PAUSE tool. This stands for Priority Areas for Walking score. This is a prioritization tool that helps us answer the question, when we have limited funds and limited capacity to deliver pedestrian projects, where are the areas of highest need across the state? And so that's the purpose of this tool. Yeah, let's hop to the next slide. So a little overview, a little background about PAWS. This tool was developed as part of our statewide pedestrian system plan that came out in 2021. As I mentioned, it helps us identify across this whole state where investments in pedestrian infrastructure are the most needed. Something to note that that you might notice when you're able to jump in and explore this tool, and I will drop a link in the chat, and Joe may be able to share that link as part of these presentation resources. This is a statewide tool. So the thresholds may look a little different than you're expecting based on your community, whether if it's more urban or more densely populated. We're basing this on need across the state. So that's kind of what it's adjusted for. We can see earlier, Joe, can you jump back to the previous slide actually? I want to take a look at those scores again.
Actually, I can open up the web map here. So
oh, awesome.
Yep.
Yeah. So we can take a look at these scores. You can see we have 4 tiers. So tier 1 is our highest priority. Tier 2 is still high priority. Tier 3 is moderate priority, and tier 4 is low priority. So the visible tiers, the red, orange, and yellow, those are going to be moderate, high, and highest priority. So we calculate these based on 2 sets of factors. That would be our equity and our demand scores. And Joe, you can now jump back to the slides.
Can do 1 second. There's things in the way. There we go.
I have you, yeah, we have you doing a lot of jumping between screens. And let's go to the next slide so we can talk more about that background. So there are a number of factors that go into both demand and equity scores. Demand broadly answers the question, does this area have places that people want or need to walk to? So these are things that broadly generate walking trips. That could be the presence of jobs, the presence of buildings generally, things like schools and higher education facilities, trails maybe. So basically it's things that say, okay, this is a place where people want or need to walk to. We also have a set of equity factors that we account for. And this is based on priority populations that we identified as part of our statewide pedestrian system planning process. And this answers the question, are people in this area disproportionately burdened by the transportation system or more likely to need to walk? So these are demographic factors. They could include things like age, low or no vehicle households, the presence of tribal lands, because we know that tribal members in our state are more likely to need to walk. So those 2 factors interact to determine the final score. Something that's different from the previous versions of PAWS that we've developed, I'll just briefly kind of go into this. It's a little bit in the weeds. But previously we just calculated the score by adding our demand and equity factors together. We did a little bit of adjustment in this update of PAWS because we noticed that something would happen is that areas, especially on tribal lands or just other areas across the state where maybe the census block group shows a high proportion of those equity populations, that might score relatively highly, but we'd notice there's actually not a lot going on there. There's maybe not a road in that hexagon. There's maybe not a building. So we recalculated our scores a little bit to make sure that for those tiers, for those hexagons that are scoring really highly, you're going to have the presence of both a lot of demand and a high equity population. You can't have the highest scores without both. Something else that I'll note about PAWS that's important to know, and Joe alluded to this earlier, we don't have great pedestrian data for ped facilities across the state. We don't necessarily know where our sidewalks are. That's true statewide as well as in the metro region. So these scores are not based on the presence or absence of sidewalks or other pedestrian facilities. In fact, a red hexagon that scores the highest might have a lot of great pedestrian facilities, a lot of good sidewalk coverage. But it just, that shows a place where you should apply some more scrutiny and think a little harder about, can we provide ped facilities here if they're not already present?
All right. Next tool.
Yeah, let's jump to space.
Let's keep moving. All right.
All right, so I will say I wasn't involved with the development of space, so I know a little bit less about this tool, but I can still give you guys an overview and we can take a look at it to see what some of the differences are. So space is a tool that is appropriate for both pedestrians and cycling, so it's a little bit less specific. And something else you'll notice about space relative to pause is that it's not tiered in the same way. So it's kind of a continuous spectrum of scores where those dark blue scores are the highest, indicating the most suitability for pedestrian and cycling infrastructure. And as you get to that green, it's lower. Why don't we click on one of these hexagons and see what kind of data is in there?
It is working.
It will think. So generally okay, great. So generally these are pretty similar factors to what we see in pause. We have these are some of the demographic factors that we might see and our equity factors. We're seeing flags for walking and biking commuters, the presence of schools, supermarkets, other kinds of trip generators. So the difference between pause space and the impact tool, I'll get into those in a little bit and talk about the pros and cons of each tool. For now, what you need to know is we have multiple tools. They can be a little bit redundant, but they have pretty similar data and will show similar things, generally speaking. So it's kind of up to you which tool you think is more intuitive, works better, gives you the information you need.
Next tool? Oh,
Yes.
I did it.
Okay, and this is the one where I can't officially share this with you yet because this is still in draft form. We are going to release this tool when we put out our statewide bike system plan later this year. But essentially the impact tool is like pause, but for biking specifically. A couple things that are important to note that are different is that we have those demand and equity scores, just like we did for pause. We did add 2 extra categories as well, and those are safety and connectivity. So safety is just our crash data, presence of vulnerable road users, and just indicating whether the roadway in the area has some safety risks. And connectivity, I think, is the kind of most interesting new one. So lack of connectivity in bike networks it can be a bigger issue for people biking necessarily than people who are walking. So our connectivity subscore is showing if you put a bike facility here, what additional level of access would it give people in this area to places they want to go? Would it meaningfully improve the connectivity of the overall network? Is it filling a gap? Is it overcoming a barrier? Is it allowing people to access grocery stores, jobs, other facilities that they might not have been able to access before? And yeah, thanks for pulling this up, Joe. You can see one thing that's nice about this version of the tool that I think we'll preserve when we make this in a final draft form is that you can see the breakdown of points based on these subscores. So something that's interesting is, when you see like a red hexagon that's right next to a yellow one, so a high next to a moderate priority, it can be kind of interesting to toggle between those two and see where that gap is coming from. So here it looks like there's still a relatively high demand subscore, but it looks like we're not seeing as many safety issues over here, and the connectivity subscore is also lower. So I would guess that there's maybe a higher risk roadway or some crash incidents over in these red hexagons that are right next to it, and that might be providing the kind of extra boost in the data there.
Very cool. So as Carolyn mentioned, this will be available later this year, and it was pretty exciting. It's the first time anyone's seen this, so you should all feel really privileged that you get to see the
Very
impact before
exciting.
it's public.
It looks a lot like Pause, but it's a little different. And yeah, some other things to note about this tool are that, of course, we're adjusting it. We thought it was worthwhile to make a separate cycling tool because biking trips are different from walking trips. They're longer. There are different facility requirements. People have different comfort levels. They're just different ways of traveling. And so we thought it was appropriate to have a tool that reflected the nuances of each. So as I mentioned before, we have a bunch of different tools, and there's not necessarily clear guidelines for which ones to use. Basically, that's because these tools evolved from some different needs and different places within MnDOT. So they meet some slightly different needs that we can keep in mind here. Biggest difference, I think, is that Space is an all-in-one tool that looks at both bikes and pedestrians. Pause and Impact are tools for those distinct modes. So Pause is pedestrian focused and Impact is biking focused. Something that's also good to know about these tools are that Pause and Impact have been updated more recently. Impact is obviously brand new. Pause, we just finished an update of this last year. Space, there are some data sets in there that have not been regularly updated. I don't know if there are plans to update these Space on a regular cycle. So if you're looking for the most current data, it's probably good to go to Pause and Impact. That being said, if you find the Space tool easier to look at, more intuitive, and it just works better for you, certainly you're welcome to use that one as well.
All right, thank you, Caroline. And so this is exciting. As we, previous planning cycle, we did not have any of these tools out there, and we really just had the RBTN, and now we've got a lot more robust planning tools to hopefully help local communities, develop pretty robust local transportation elements, both for pedestrian and cyclists coming up for the 2050 cycle. We'll be moving on here. So the next topic, we'll be kicking it over to Ryan and Jacob, but next we're looking at, understanding the actual usage of your trails and sidewalks in your community that can help you planning to develop improvements or potentially looking at areas where you do not have facilities and where those are most needed in your community via real hard data collected out in the wild. And so Ryan, I'll kick it over to you or whoever wants to take over.
I'll start out. Yeah, thank you.
Jacob,
thank you, Joe. Yeah, roughly about a dozen years ago, MnDOT started a program to collect and provide data about bicyclists and pedestrians traveling, throughout Minnesota's communities. We have a network of 36 permanent counters spread across the state in different geographic contexts, like small towns, rural shoulders in the suburbs, and also kind of throughout Minneapolis and St. Paul as well. The permanent counters are really useful for understanding longer term trends in active transportation in Minnesota. But we also have portable counters that are useful tools to local governments such as yourselves who may want to use them for planning purposes. As you can see on this maybe confusing mapping graphic, each of those circles with numbers in it represents the number of sites that have where we've conducted short duration counts. And it disappeared, but you can see that we've collected more than data from more than 150 different sites across the metro region. I'm going to, briefly tell you reasons why you'd maybe want to conduct a count, and then Ryan's going to tell you about how you can borrow this equipment from us and what it looks like to set it up. And then I'll follow up with some examples of what successful counts looked like. Next slide, please. So there are a handful of reasons why you'd want to conduct a count. One of the most easy ones to understand is conducting a pre and post construction count. So if you know that you're going to be installing a bike lane or a sidewalk, you might want to take an opportunity to capture traffic before your construction begins, just so you have some baseline data. After it's constructed, you can then take a count again, preferably the same week and the time of year, like the third week of July, before the, for a pre-construction count in the third week of July after it's already been constructed, then you can kind of compare to see if there's been a difference in traffic patterns. And that's a really effective way to kind of evaluate the effectiveness of your installation, if it's being used more or if it's not. If you're thinking about adding a bike lane or a sidewalk, you can also use the counter to see if people are walking or biking on a particular stretch of road. Actually, last year, Ryan and I worked with the city of St. Paul to capture pedestrian traffic on a stretch of Marshall Avenue where there wasn't a sidewalk. There was evidence of foot traffic. There was a desire line, but we set up a counter. And we got confirmation that yes, indeed, people were walking that part of Marshall, and they've since put a sidewalk in there. And so I think Ryan and I are going to go out later this summer and do a post construction count. But that's really an effective way of demonstrating demand or justifying investments. If you see that there is indeed traffic where you're thinking about adding infrastructure. You can also track changes over time. Let's say you have a multi-use path and you're interested in learning about year-over-year growth, whether that be negative growth, flat growth, or positive growth. I mean, you can set up a counter for every week, for 1 week every year or seasonally, and track that change in usage. You can support grant applications with data. I mean, probably most of you already know this. You put data in a grant application, it just makes it stronger, especially if it's supporting your case. You can engage decision makers with data, planning directors, city council, other decision makers. You can share data with them and help them make informed decisions and justify your own decisions too. And then also, if there's a special event happening in your community, you can track event participation. If you know that there's going to be a larger than normal volume of pedestrians or bicyclists on a sidewalk or a bike lane, say there's a 5K, or some sort of other formal gathering, you can set up a counter and track bike and ped traffic that way. All right, next slide. And I'm going to hand it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Jacob. Yeah, so as Jacob alluded to, we have a suite of permanent counters, but we also have a fleet of portable short duration counters that are available to communities, counties, organizations across the state at no charge for you to conduct your own counts. So you can check this equipment out. The kit that you might check out looks very similar to what you see on the screen here, with the tools and the supplies and the devices you would need to install. We can help with that installation, and we can also help you with data processing and analysis thereafter. We typically recommend doing a 1 to 2 week count as a good kind of baseline to get weekdays and weekends, and maybe to account for any weather that unexpected weather that might cause something atypical over that period. But we just ask that you complete a request form at the link shown on the screen, and we'll put that in the chat, or Jacob just did put it in the chat, so that we can reach out and maybe confirm some details, ask you questions, and maybe there's some brainstorming we need to do. If you're thinking, I want to do a count, I don't know exactly what I want to do. We're happy to brainstorm with you and kind of figure out what makes the most sense for your community, for your situation, and the question that you're trying to answer. So next slide, Joe. So wanted to show you some of the contexts in which you could install these counters. This is actually that example that Jacob mentioned along Marshall Avenue in St. Paul last year. This is one side of the road that does have a sidewalk, or did have a sidewalk in summer 2025. So we installed what you see pretty discreetly installed on the light post. There is a little device that counts total traffic in either direction. So it just gives you one number, eastbound and westbound in this case. Does not distinguish between bikes and pedestrians, but gives you a really good sense of how many people in general are using the facility. It counts across that sidewalk, and in this case, we pointed it at a grassy hill as opposed to the retaining wall that's up ahead, because there's a good post up there to install on, but we figured it might be capturing folks who might sit on that retaining wall or might be entering or exiting that building. So there's some things to take into account when you choose a site, as far as will people gather in that location and kind of screw with the counts and that kind of thing. Next slide, Joe. Here's that other side of the street that did not have a sidewalk as of summer 2025. You can sort of see that desire line there, but we same, very, very similar install. I wanted to get a good sense for how many people and when they were using this facility. And simply by being out there and installing these counters, we also got to talk to folks who live and work in the area to understand some of the dangerous crossing behaviors that were happening for folks that didn't want to walk in the grass, that were kind of darting across the road in a place where there's heavy truck traffic. And so getting some of those anecdotal stories is one of the benefits of going out and setting up this equipment in the first place. Next slide, Joe. You can install these on bike lanes on the road as well. It gets a little bit more complicated because you end up drilling into the pavement, but it's doable. And again, that's something we could help you do and help you install and show you how to do it for future reference. And so in this case, this is another example from St. Paul. They had a lot of upcoming projects where they wanted to get good pre-construction baseline data last summer. And so this is on East Lafayette Frontage Road, which is a use case that Jacob will highlight in a couple later slides. But a pretty simple installation that'll show you directionally where bikes are going. So people who are using this bike lane in the correct or the incorrect direction. Next slide, Joe. And then shared use paths. Of course, you can install these across your typical shared use path. In this case, this is a device that counts both with a infrared laser, those boxes that are installed on the posts there, and then the tubes across the roadway allow the device to distinguish between pedestrians and bicycles. And so you get those taped down, and you can just nail like tent spikes down into the grass. So this is an easier install than, say, like an on-road, like a bike lane or a shared travel lane. And something worth noting, it's not necessary that you put the tubes down. If you just want to get a total number on your shared use path, similar to the sidewalk setup, you could just install this counter without the tubes and get that number in either direction. You wouldn't be able to distinguish between pedestrians and bikes, but maybe for your case, that doesn't necessarily matter. And then just one last context location on the next slide. You can sometimes set these up in more complicated areas. This is further down Marshall Avenue, where we were counting both a bike lane, but also the adjacent sidewalk. And you'll notice too, there's a parking lane in between those two. So it's kind of an interesting setup where we were able to capture a lot of different travel patterns going on in this location. And it was sort of an experiment, wondering, will people park on the tubes? We found that they weren't parking on them too much. So that was good. But yeah, next slide, Joe. And then just wanted to quickly highlight that if you're not interested in setting up equipment, manual counting is still a great way to collect data. You can validate or ground truth the counting devices that you have installed to make sure they're counting properly. You can supplement those counts with more characteristics. You could set out there for an hour or two to sort of distinguish generally how many adults versus kids are using a facility, helmets versus no helmets on cyclists, e-bikes, e-scooters, traditional bikes, maybe wheelchair users or otherwise. Maybe people walking dogs is of interest, for instance. It's also a great way to engage community members in the planning process if that's something you're trying to do, like a citizen science data collection initiative, to get folks out there volunteering for a few hours at a time to get a better sense for who's using facilities when. And like I mentioned, you get a lot of good anecdotal data or things that maybe are unexpected patterns that you wouldn't otherwise see, like dangerous behaviors, close calls at intersections, other desire lines that you didn't know were out there by sitting out and observing. This is also a good idea at intersections. Our count equipment isn't great at complex intersections where it might accidentally count cars at the same time, for instance. And these, manual counting can also be done in person, or it can be done via a camera, and then you can process that data later and kind of watch it at your convenience. So we do have some resources on our website that we'll drop a link to, like a tally sheet that you could use and adapt for your own use if this is something that's of interest. But yeah, I think at this point I'll throw it back over to Jacob.
Yeah, thanks for advancing, Joe, and thank you for that, Ryan. Yeah, I just wanted to go over two use cases. This is my favorite one, the East Lafayette Frontage Road. It's a really great example of a pre and post construction count, and also demonstrating demand. Let me just sort of describe the area. So many of you may be familiar with the Lafayette Bridge. It is a bridge on the east side of downtown St. Paul. On the side of the bridge, there's a two-way shared use path, so pedestrians and bicyclists can go either way. Doesn't matter which way they go, but when they do go south, when bicyclists go south, the bridge ends on Lafayette Frontage Road, where there is a one-way bike lane heading north. So bicyclists are traveling south, but they are confronted with the situation of, well, I guess I need to bike south on this one-way bike lane that's going north. A half a block away, where in this picture you can see at the traffic light, a two-way facility picks up. So the city of St. Paul was interested in better understanding how many people were biking the wrong way southbound on the frontage road. We set up a counter for 2 weeks, and we discovered that 43% of the traffic was headed the wrong way. That's just dangerous behavior that really isn't good for anybody. And I know that St. Paul had planned to convert this into a two-way facility because they recognized that that was an issue, but they didn't actually have the data to back up those numbers. We supplied them the data, and I'm not sure if they've made the change yet, but I know it's at least in the works. So I really like highlighting this one just because it captured data where bicyclists were kind of putting themselves at risk. Next slide.
And I'll just note on this one too. This was a project that the city also received grant funding through MnDOT because of the issues that we're noting here too. So again, data helping to receive grant funds.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. And then finally, this is a pedestrian bridge over Minnesota Highway 15. It connects a neighborhood to a school. And a frequent borrower of our counting equipment wanted to understand usage patterns on this bridge, including if it was more popular during the week or on the weekend, but then also hourly patterns. And he also wanted to understand how this changed seasonally. So he sets up the counter for 2 weeks every season: winter, spring, summer, and fall. You can see the pictures there. If you advance to the next slide, Joe, you could see in these usage patterns that during the week, the time spikes during morning commute to work. Commute to school time, so around 8 a.m. And then in the afternoon, it again peaks when school lets out at 4 p.m., which kind of makes sense. And there was less usage on the weekend that they registered. And then also you could see in the average daily users by month, they were really interested in grabbing that information. May and September, when it's really pleasant, more kids are walking and biking to school, and that's reflected in that data. Do we have another slide after this, Joe? Could you advance it?
I'm hopping in next one. So
okay.
But But yeah, I'll just note that this is a really great tool if you're doing any safe route school studies, right, to really understand kind of where students are coming and going and what times they are doing so to your various schools you're doing your studies for, to really understand where those improvements can make the most difference.
Yeah.
But jumping over to a few other tools here at the end. Knowing that MnDOT only has a handful of these counters in the whole metro region, and so if everyone wanted to do a count at the same time, you just wouldn't have enough counters to reach everybody. And so there's other ways that you can perform counts. There's the manual counts, as Ryan was describing. Those can be very time and labor intensive, right? You've got to tally all those counts yourself. You've got to set up the cameras. You got to go out there and actually do the counts, right? But there's other ways that you can also do some counts here. I wanted to just highlight some of our Transportation Advisory Board members have pointed me to some of these tools that they've actually utilized in their local communities to help understand what's going on in their roadways. And so some of these there's these new automatic counters that are really coming out that can be used both at the local level or potentially at a different level or the private level. These are devices which use cameras and AI to count all users moving past a point while maintaining anonymity, so they don't necessarily track faces, things like that. They're just counting raw, people, bikes, vehicles moving through a certain area. One here called TELRAM. This is one that, again, one of our Transportation Advisory Board members has utilized in St. Paul is a really cool tool that tracks real-time data and identifies between pedestrians, bikes, vehicles, trucks, things like that to really understand kind of what's happening on a street where this device is located. I'd look note here the city of San Francisco actually utilizes these quite a bit in the city, and you can see here the data is, again, it's by the hour, it's really up to date, it really helps count. There's limitations with these. I've heard, they potentially have some issues with identifying certain users at certain times of day or for certain weather conditions, but it's free to use. For if you have one of these set up, you can utilize it freely. If you have a network of these, there's a network fee, but also want to note just the affordability of these. These are anywhere from $200 to $250 per device. So at the community level, you could deploy these pretty quickly to really get an understanding in your own community for pretty cheap. If you have just one device, it's free to use. If you have multiple, there's a fee to utilize those. But just want to point out some other tools here. Another one here that we highlighted, I've worked with some of these people here, is called UpCity. So it's very similar to TELRAM in that it provides hour-by-hour counts. It utilizes AI and other sort of sensors to actually do those counts automatically and then uploads that data for your use at your community. Data is stored on site and available for use, but it's not public. So TELRAM, the data is public, but UpCity, that'd be something you could have without it being public information if there's any security or privacy issues with that as well. They didn't provide the pricing or data on this per device, but it's likely to be close to what you'd see at TELRAM. So they're cheap ways to get quick counts out there and deploy these in your community quickly if maybe potentially MnDOT's uses are not available. Other data sources we want to note here is there's Strava, so the app that if you can turn it on, it tracks your bike ride, it tells you your speed, tells you your distance, locations, things like that. And there's something called Strava Metro, which is free to use for all public users, and it helps. It gives you just more data to understand kind of where people are using your system, where they are doing it, and kind of where those volumes are really focusing on your system. Obviously, with Strava, you're going to get a lot more people using it for recreational purposes and maybe their day-to-day transportation purposes. But again, it's another tool to potentially utilize to understand kind of where those users are using your systems in your local context. So that said, that's what we have here today. I'm going to just highlight a few additional opportunities coming up, and then we only have a couple minutes here, but maybe if there's any questions, we can answer a few of them here. But tomorrow, do want to give a shout out to, we will be out in the field actually setting one of these counters up. So we want to invite everyone here today. And if you haven't signed up or RSVP'd yet, you do not have to. If you want to show up tomorrow, you can do that. We'll have our sign-in sheet so you can get potentially some credits for showing up to that. That'll be tomorrow at 11 a.m. at the 9 Mile Creek overpass on Trunk Highway 62. We have an address here. So we'll be meeting at the Creek Valley Soccer Field parking lot, which is really a couple steps away from this overpass. Everyone's welcome. MnDOT, Ryan, and I believe a few other MnDOT people will be setting up, show you how to set these up, show you how it looks, show you how it works in the field, actually. Get outside, enjoy the outdoors on a Friday morning. And additionally to that, we have additional PlanIt webinar series coming up that's specific to our pedestrian planning requirements and the overview of that. And then also our new safety planning requirements as well over to that. Those are likely to be August. And we'll potentially have additional tools and templates to help you develop your pedestrian and safety elements of your plans moving forward. Just give you an idea where that looks like in the world. So you got Trunkaway 52 here, and then you've got Creek Valley Elementary School being right around here with the parking lot there to set up that counter.